So, my name's Headley Rees, and I write and talk a lot about the medicines industry, pharmaceuticals, Big Pharma, some of the pitfalls, some of the things that are going wrong, some of the things that are potentially going right. And this is the first of a series of 10 videos where hopefully I'm going to tell you some things that you didn't know about Big Pharma. So this is a series of 10 things you didn't know about Big Pharma. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is penicillin. Penicillin goes back a long way in the early stage of medicine's development, and I suppose if you ask the man in the street who discovered penicillin, most people would say Alexander Fleming. To an extent that's correct, but it's not wholly correct. In fact, it's very important that we recognise it's not wholly correct. So in 1928, Alexander Fleming found in his culture dish, he found a mould that appears to be killing bacteria. But he didn't know what the chemical entity was inside the mould that was doing that. And in fact, it took over 10 years for Fleming to get someone interested in helping him identify what the active ingredient was. He eventually went along to Oxford University, met a gentleman named Howard Florey, and they were able to isolate the active ingredient and also to make very small quantities that they could use for preclinical and clinical studies to run some tests in animals. And also some tests in humans, and at that time it was the Second World War and it was life or death, so testing in humans had to be done there and then, and with those preclinical clinical tests they produced even more evidence that they had something here that was potentially life-saving, but they couldn't make it in any quantity. And they scratched their heads, and in the end they ended up flying to the US, and they actually met with the forerunners of the FDA. Effectively, regulators, this is the United States Department of Agriculture, which eventually became moved into the FDA, and a gentleman there called Andrew J. Moyer, he was an expert in the manufacture of molds, and he actually said, well, why don't we culture this in a mixture of corn syrup and lactose or something like that. He had some sort of clever idea, and he designed the process, and he increased the yield exponentially. And it was only then that penicillin could be used to treat soldiers in the war and other people with infection. So that myth, and it is a myth, and this was actually highlighted by a gentleman named Robert Gaines, who's written a book called Germ Theory. He wrote an article in 2017 that basically explains all this, and if anyone wants the reference to that, I can give it to them. But you have to think that the myth that drugs are discovered by accident is a complete myth. You think if Fleming hadn't been able to contact Florey and Moyer, he'd still be sitting there now wondering what is in that mould, and penicillin wouldn't have become to the world. And the obverse of that is that if Florey from Oxford University and A.J. Moyer from USDA had been with Fleming at the time to develop penicillin would have moved probably from 12, 13, 14 years down to 2 or 3 years. So you ask yourself, well, why is it still taking 8 to 10 years to develop a drug some 80 years later? Well, I'll explain that in the next episode, and I think hopefully that was something that you didn't know, and I think equally the next one that we record, you won't know either. So until then, all the best. Speak soon. Bye.